All right.
All right. You ready to go?
I'm ready, Chuck. What do you think about this, the last part of this chapter? Let me just throw it right over to you.
Yeah. So I think we were in just those last couple of sections on self-control and interest. And the self-interest and rationality section was one that I really was very interested in. And you and I have talked a little bit about how there tends to be sort of a continuum between people who tend to think very much individualistically. The individual is the key center of society, and we've seen that both in sort of modern philosophy, where be true to one's own self, but we also see that, I think, even in some Christian philosophy, where the focus of the gospel tends to be first on the individual salvation. And then we see on the other side of that spectrum, we see something that is a little more communitarian, or actually, the author of this chapter calls it collectivist here, which gives perhaps a different accent when you say collectivist versus communitarian. But the idea there is that the community becomes more paramount, or the human race, or something like that. And that both in secular philosophy, where often there is a focus on decision making and proper ethics, not necessarily being handed down from God, but being simply a way to promote flourishing in society, whatever that may. And then on the Christian end, that as well, with people who talk much more about the importance of the church and the importance of the Christian community, the communion of saints. And we know that to some extent, there needs to be a balance, right? There is a sense in which the individual certainly plays a role. And there is a sense in which, as individuals, we are the elect. God has chosen individuals to be elect persons, not merely communities. And yet, on the other side, God often works through communities as his primary way of acting out the gospel and bringing about salvation. And so it was interesting then to me that in this section on self interest and rationality, we see that sort of continuum was already present among these medieval thinkers. And so you've got Godfrey of Fontaine is the first solution put forward, who claims that an individual life has a lesser value than the common good for a rationally behaving person. And so this is his explanation for why people are often willing to sacrifice their own individual self interest for a larger good. And we see that, perhaps we've been seeing a little bit of that in the news, where we see in Ukraine people sacrificing their own safety, and men of 60 years old going off and fighting a war, and in a very dangerous circumstances. And at 60 years old, and I'm only 7 years away from that. It's like, how do you keep up, and how can you stay? But the people do that, and there is that sense. But then you see that Henry of Ghent, he takes a little bit of a different approach at it, and he objects, saying that when you look at the situation, and he talks about a metaphor about a part of the body allowing itself to be cut off for the good of the whole. And he says, but look, if the limb that was being cut off for the greater good of the body had its own mind, it probably wouldn't make the choice to sacrifice itself for the whole. And he believes very much in an individualistic way of looking at things, and thinks that even decisions that seem to be made for the greater good of a larger community realistically arise from individualistic considerations. And then we have the Franciscan authors of the time who think differently yet. And unlike Henry of Ghent and unlike Godfrey of Fontaine, who really focus on this classical Greek presumption that the primary motivational force is self interest, they say that human freedom is wide enough to allow the possibility of recognizing other ultimate ends besides one's own happiness. And the interesting thing there, I have my doubts whether the author of this chapter, and I just keep calling him the author because I don't know how to pronounce his name. But I don't think that he's actually making a reference to the Westminster Confession, and that the first part of that, what is the chief end of man or the ultimate end of man? And it's to enjoy God for forever. And but in some ways, that's the Franciscans, I think, would have perhaps agreed with that and understood that there are other ultimate ends besides individual happiness, but certainly pleasing God would have to be one of those. And of course, Franciscans then agree that human beings all have this natural tendency to act for their own individual interests, but that's not really what morality is all about. That goes far beyond that, and that human beings can strive for these other ultimate ends in part in their life, and that can account for why certain types of decisions may be rationally made and yet don't necessarily result in the best interest of the individual making those decisions. So I found that last bit just really interesting because it does tie together some other discussions that we've had about how do we think about individuality versus community, those.
Thank you for opening that way. What an interesting tension, isn't it, Chuck? We see that there's some aspects of morality that you and I, as individuals, need to bootstrap from the community we grow up in, the people we live around, as well as the authors we read. So we get our ideas about reality from the people around us. But yet, at the same point in time, there's this individual idea that there's this me, there's this I, there's this id, ego, super ego, to make a Freudian distinction that some have made, that there are pieces or parts of us as an intellect that are making these ultimate determinations. And we've talked before about the difficulties associated with the modern phenomenology. So this chapter is talking about how the medieval authors are thinking about ideas of self-sacrifice and self-interest and some of the positions so well. So thank you for that. I wanted to share this. Before coming on for our discussion session today, I was watching a video of a cave explorer, and it was a small hole in the wall of a cave, barely large enough for a small person to fit in and to go through. And on top of that hole was filled with water. So this video was recording one of the cave explorers going through that very narrow part in the opening. And Chuck, I don't know about you, I don't do great in caves, and I very much felt the claustrophobia of the setting as that cave explorer kept trying to squeeze more and more through that hole covered in water and having no room to maneuver his hands or his legs, but just to squeeze through there, maybe like a cat might try to squeeze through a very narrow place. Anyway, what was my point? My idea was that we have this sort of academic mode in philosophical circles where we think about rationality in the classic ivory tower sense. You and I are sitting in our comfortable chairs. We have our popcorn and our snacks with us. Maybe in a generation past, it would have been a pipe or some other creature comfort. We're sitting in our study, pleasantly contemplating things and trying to arrive at a decision. And yet, when you're actually trying to squeeze through this small crevice in the rocks, where you have to go under the water to get through the crevice, and you don't have any room to move your hands and your feet, and you have to crawl through, and it's just so constrained. And my point was this: it was just extremely uncomfortable watching this person do that. Now, of course, this person enjoyed doing it and did it voluntarily, and I think things worked out well in the end. But the point was, I remember thinking to myself, at some point, I was almost so claustrophobically affected that I thought, I don't want to watch this video anymore. This is very difficult for me to contemplate. And I thought, what do we do with the idea of self if ethical and moral values that are related to what the chapter is talking about here, ideas of self-control, rationality, sacrifice, what do we do if they come into that area, Chuck, where it's not only hard for me to contemplate in the sense that it might be hard for my brain to think about it, but it's also viscerally uncomfortable. And that's where I think some of the thinkers here were trying to talk about these concepts. It's not just as if we can start with this model of human beings as being able to abstract out these visceral discomforts, these bodily passions, let's say, that are associated with the human condition. And so I was struck with that. Who can solve that? And in the modern sense, when people have made self the highest arbiter, doesn't that mean that things that make us uncomfortable, viscerally so, can then become ethically out of bounds? And maybe we can see here now why in our society today it's so being offensive is such a critical discussion flashpoint. If there are people who have lived their lives so as to base their lives upon something that, when confronted with that in a less than favorable light, gives them that visceral pullback, then we've really got a problem here. And I wonder, how important is it for the ethicist, the philosopher, the thinker in the medieval ages? How important is it for that person to take that into account in their bookkeeping? And I don't know if that directly relates to the material here, Chuck, but what do you think? Where would you go with that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question and an interesting thing to think about. I think you're right to posit a connection between the primacy of the self, the primacy of our own internal thinking about ourselves and our own desires and our own wishes, that inner light, and a primary focus on comfort or discomfort as a key part of how we think about ethics. I think you're right in positing that. And there is a sense in which I see a couple of problems with that. One is oftentimes the same type of concerns, ethical concerns that we might have if we're focused solely on comfort or discomfort, they, those ethical concerns may align with other focuses. As an example, there does seem to be a movement towards in the workplace that the primacy of not making people feel uncomfortable. And so you don't talk about certain things or you don't behave in certain ways. Now, there are reasons why we might not talk about certain things, might not behave in certain ways in the workplace that are separate from merely concepts of discomfort. And in fact, I think most people would agree that there may be people who purposely use discomfort and bullying, that kind of thing, as a way of getting what they want. But if we're so focused solely on who's comfortable and who's not, we may not get to the real root of the issues. I think there is some real concern about that. Now, I would say that I probably wouldn't completely toss away the idea that to some extent, thinking about somebody else's comfort can be a positive thing. In scripture, we see the thought, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And there's a sense in which that is talking about, in some ways, the same types of things that we're talking about here. You have a level of self interest, you have a level in which you rationally wish to preserve yourself, but you should behave towards others in the same way that you attempt to protect your own self-interest. So have the interest of others also in mind. And so there's a sense when we do that, having the interest of others, we don't want to unnecessarily hurt people's feelings. We don't want to unnecessarily put blocks up that make people uncomfortable. But again, that then in that way of thinking about things, what's primary is still truth. And there are times, I think, when truth can be uncomfortable, and we have to think about what are winning ways to present the truth. And sometimes those winning ways are going to involve a level of discomfort. Perhaps we want to avoid purposeful discomfort. We want to avoid unnecessary discomfort, but it's not primary. And interestingly, to bring it back then to the medieval thinkers, I suspect that the medieval thinkers weren't even thinking about these sort of issues of comfort versus discomfort, at least in the way that we do, because it just wasn't part of it wasn't necessarily a part of their way of thinking, right? It was much more uncomfortable to live in the 14th century, for example, than it is today. And perhaps that plays a little bit of role in how we think about these things too. But I like that thought where that limiting oneself to really only one's self-interest and one's self-desire as the number one key reason for taking any kind of action and thinking of that as the center point of rationality, it can lead to that. Whereas if we are more willing to think of uh, others and to think of the community, even if we don't go full on collectivist, there is a sense in which a level of discomfort on behalf of the greater good of the whole, of the church, for example, or of a community, of a nation, can be of great benefit. And so we don't want to focus solely on just that idea of comfort. Now, I don't know if I want to make sure that I was thinking in the same direction that you were in riffing off of what you were saying, and I did not going off in some crazy direction. But that's kind of where I was headed as you were talking about that particular concept. Does that sort of fit a little bit with what you were talking about as well?